Tonight's debate in South Carolina is a final opportunity for voters to see all 7 candidates together before Saturday's primary and Super Tuesday. Pete Buttigieg just scored an endorsement from one of South Carolina's largest newspapers called The State. It says, and I'm quoting here, Buttigieg's appeal to African Americans should be judged by this standard. Is his outreach genuine, and is it being undertaken in good faith? We believe that it is. Well, this comes after Buttigieg was confronted by racial justice protesters during a strike by McDonald's workers. Demonstrators called out the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, for his minimum wage policies. Well, now I want to check back in with my colleague Vladimir Duthiers, who's at the site of tonight's debate in Charleston. Vlad.
Thanks so much, Rena. So I'm here, of course, joined by Jamal Simmons and Molly Hooper. Jamal Simmons is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Molly Hooper is a CBSN political contributor. Welcome.
Welcome.
Hey, see you guys here in South Carolina.
Yeah, South Carolina.
That's cool.
Yeah, got columns and everything.
Got columns. We got a jib. Got a jib out there. There it is. You know, jib shot. How about that jib shot?
We just need some palm trees, right?
Palmettos.
Palmettos.
They're called palmettos, Molly. They're called palmettos here in South Carolina. All right, let's talk about Mayor Pete Buttigieg and his outreach with African American voters. Jamal, what is he doing to boost his support among African American voters? Because it's been tough. It's been a tough road for him.
So the people in the campaign have said they're reaching out to people. They're trying to have meetings. I think they've been doing small meetings with individuals to try to get it. The problem for Buttigieg is, I remember when Bill Clinton first ran for office, he was from a small state in Arkansas. He was a conservative Democrat from an anti-union state. But every African-American you ever met from Arkansas had a story about Bill Clinton and how much they loved Bill Clinton, right? You don't have that when it comes to Pete Buttigieg. Who are his validators of the people who know him the most? It doesn't seem like those people like him very much. I mean, Andre Carson, who is the only Congressional Black Caucus member from Indiana, doesn't seem to have much to say about Pete Buttigieg, and that's got to matter at some place like this.
Right, and it's also interesting. I mean, he does actually have one member of the Congressional Black Caucus, Anthony Brown, from Maryland, who has endorsed him and is sort of serving as this national co-chair of the caucus. I mean, of his presidential campaign, trying to do a lot of outreach to African American voters, but I'm not sure that it's sticking so much. It's interesting, though, being here in Charleston and seeing all the advertisements that are all over the news channels and the broadcast channels, and Pete Buttigieg just comes up, and it's like Pete with all these members of the African American community sort of showing he's like, oh, I've got all this support, but it doesn't seem to translate in the polls.
That's really interesting. And I guess ultimately, at the end of the day, the fact that he's struggled with African American voters, and if he continues to struggle after the votes are counted in South Carolina, well, it's going to be really hard for him to make a case going into Super Tuesday that he does have that traction with the largest voting bloc of Democrats in the country.
Absolutely. You look at these states that are online coming up, Alabama, Mississippi, even going into California and Texas. I mean, there are voters there that he's got to appeal to. He's hit a bit of a valley. We'll see whether or not he can come out of it.
All right, Molly, let me ask you about this. We saw in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, there's been some criticism of Vice President Biden, some controversy over comments that he's made on the campaign trail that says that he was arrested in 1977 while trying to see Nelson Mandela. The Washington Post investigated his claims, and ultimately they've given him 4 Pinocchios, which means essentially it's not true, at least as far as they can tell. The question is, we've asked his campaign why. We really haven't gotten any answers, but is this something that could potentially damage his reputation with African-American voters if it's done in an attempt to ingratiate himself with those voters?
Well, it could, or what he could do is flip it tonight at the debate and say, listen, what I have done in South Africa is I was leading on anti-apartheid movement in the Senate. He was one of the key senators blocking the U.S. from doing business with companies in South Africa. He could do that, but this I'm not sure is necessarily unusual for Joe Biden. I mean, he's skirted sort of the truth sometimes in the past.
Yeah.
He had an issue with plagiarism in a book that he wrote way back when.
Right.
And it was actually, I think, one of the reasons why he dropped out in 1988. He was a presidential candidate for 3 months, essentially, and then had to drop out. So, again, it really depends on how what he does with this news, whether he embraces it or, he pivots.
There's another part people think, Uncle Joe likes to tell stories.
Right.
Sometimes those stories are true, but maybe you don't want to get focused on the details and pay attention to the policy or the substance of what he's trying to say. But this is something that is in line with Joe Biden's history. People have heard this about him for a long, long time.
Right,
but he does tell some good stories, I'll tell you that much.
And he's repeated it twice. And I guess the question becomes, in a time and a place where you have a president of the United States who is also known to tell stories about a friend who tells him that Paris is the worst city in the world and nobody can find this friend.
Everybody's saying it.
Everybody's saying it. Everybody's saying it. Nobody wants to go to Paris anymore. I wonder if that's what Democrats are looking for in a president. If they want somebody, certainly they want someone who has the common touch, which everybody says that Joe Biden does have. But do you want somebody representing this party similar to the current occupant of the White House?
I think Democrats are looking for a couple of different things. You got younger Democrats, more liberals, who are looking for somebody who's going to, change the system. As Elizabeth Warren says, big structural change. Obviously, Bernie Sanders is running on that. You got older African Americans and some of the other older voters who are out there who all really just want somebody who can beat Donald Trump, and they kind of don't really care about what the flavor of that is, as long as the person they think is strong enough, courageous enough, and maybe has a little bit of it.
So if Vice President Biden does well tonight at the debate, and he delivers a couple of knockout blows to people who are undecided, and they see him once again, as the front runner, the one to take on Donald Trump in the general election, then the stuff that we're talking about may not even matter.
Sure.
Right. I mean, look at how quickly this news cycle goes. It's just bam, 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 Twitter this, Twitter that, And when Donald Trump made those comments about Paris the next day, what else was in the news? What else did he say? So I'm not sure if this necessarily will stick, but not doing well in South Carolina obviously will stick, and that's what he needs to focus on.
Joe Biden has the most goodwill of anybody running for president. I think most Democrats who are not necessarily Bernie Sanders supporters, most Democrats would love to see Joe Biden be the nominee of the party because he is so comfortable, familiar. He was with Barack Obama all those years, all those things. The problem is the reality of Joe Biden's campaign this year is not living up to the hype of the Joe Biden legacy. And so I think people are feeling a little like maybe he's not up to the job anymore. Hopefully at a night like this, for Democrats who support him, hopefully they'll see him and say, you know what, maybe Joe Biden can still do it. Let's go ahead and get back behind him.
All right, let me ask you about another controversial comment that this time it was made by Senator Bernie Sanders in an interview he gave to 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper. He talked about Fidel Castro. A lot of people are dinging him for that. Both Republicans and some Democrats are dinging him for those comments. But Molly, at the end of the day, Senator Sanders does represent a movement. It is very similar to a movement that we saw to elect President Trump, which is people who feel disenfranchised, people who feel left out of the system, are signing on to his vision for America. The question, of course, becomes if that vision is sometimes in line with what traditional Democrats expect for the nominee of the party. And when you get a comment like that about Fidel Castro and you anger people in a state like Florida, what does that mean going forward?
Well, that's the key. It's Florida. And that's, a massive swing state, very influential in what happens with the presidential election. And when we're hearing from Democratic members who represent districts, in Miami and whatnot, and they're calling out Bernie Sanders and just saying it's not acceptable, what does that say about what they are hearing from their constituents, many of whom are from Cuba and escaped that? Now, the people who actually escaped had kids, and now how do their kids feel about it, and are their kids going to vote? And it seems like with Bernie Sanders, the movement is so much younger. He's attracting those millennial voters, and the question really is that comment resonating enough with those millennial voters, of Cuban descent? It's unclear at this point.
And he does, Jamal, try to say, he did sort of say, look, unlike the current occupant of the White House, I don't pal around with, I don't exchange love letters with Kim Jong-un. I'm paraphrasing here, but, I'm not, I don't find Putin to be somebody that I want to align myself with or get close to. Sort of trying to say, look, Donald Trump is embracing some of the very bad people that are dictators in their countries right now.
That's right. And I think, listen, there are people who support Bernie Sanders who I think none of this will matter a lick, right? They love him, they'll be with him, whatever. But he's at 25 to 30% of the Democratic Party with that number. The question is, how does he grow? How does he get that number up to 35, 40, 45% of the Democratic voters heading into the convention? And this is, listen, I was trained as an operative in the Democratic Party, and the classic fight between the operatives, the people who run and win campaigns, and sometimes lose them, and the people who are the advocates, it's always a debate. campaigns are not necessarily exercises to educate the public. You might be able to educate the public on one or two issues, but this is an exercise to win an election, to exert power. And I think the question becomes, how many voters really want to debate the merits of the Fidel Castro regime in the middle of this presidential campaign?
Right.
And that's what Donald Trump is betting on, and even some of the Democratic rivals, is that they'll get people thrown off of the Bernie Sanders wagon because nobody really wants to have a conversation about Fidel.
But, you know, I've asked this question to you, Molly, and to you, Jamal, and to everybody who sits at this table with me with regards to the fact that, look, are Democrats in danger of, much in the same way that Republicans, when candidate Trump was rising in the polls, you had Republicans, all of whom now are his biggest supporters in the Senate and in Congress, saying if Donald Trump is the nominee, it will destroy the Republican Party. And then if Donald Trump is president, it'll destroy the country. Those are the same people that voted to acquit him in the impeachment trial right now. Those are the same people that, you know, twist and turn themselves into supporting whatever the president says and he does. I wonder then, in the same way, are Democrats in danger of missing this movement that is supporting Senator Sanders, that wants to see a change in Washington, and they think that he's the best vehicle for that change?
I think that, if I might, I think the difference is Bernie Sanders has been a member of Congress since 1991, and in that time, that entire time, only one bill that he has been the lead co-sponsor of has become law. Compare that to Joe Biden, and that number is like 14.
Right.
Excuse me, not 14. I think it's like 7 or 8. Amy Klobuchar, same, higher numbers. And Bernie Sanders has a strong record, and is you know, he's devoted to his convictions, and he knows what he believes, and he's not going to move. Donald Trump was a Democrat, became a Republican, and he just wants people to like him. I mean, really, you know, I mean, I say that jokingly, but, you know, he works with members in the Republican Party and people who figured out how to encourage him to you know, endorse certain legislation. I think that Democrats worry that there won't be that same give and take with a Bernie Sanders. And that could be problematic for Democrats who are on those down ballots.
What do you hear about that?
Well, yeah, here's the challenge. It's that Bernie Sanders isn't just fighting Donald Trump and the Republicans. He's fighting about 30% of the Democratic Party. In his remarks and his tweets, he comes after the establishment of the Democratic Party. At some point, you know, Barack Obama was an insurgent candidate in 2007 and 8. But he always left the door open and said, join me on this campaign and let's do this together. Even if you oppose me, join me and let's do this together. Bernie Sanders sort of says, I'm going to beat you too. Like, I'm going to depose the establishment of the Democratic Party. We're going to take over the Democratic Party. We're going to win. So he expects the establishment to get behind him, yet it still seems like he's declared war on the establishment. He's got to figure out at what point does he pivot, if ever, to try to bring those people in. And the one thing about Democrats that I worry about is Democrats aren't like Republicans, aren't movement, like organization people. They get behind a person, they fall in love, not fall in line. Even if people get on board with Bernie Sanders in name, will they just carp at him and tweet about him to the point where they nip him to death and he loses from a lack of 1,000 cuts or a bunch of 1,000 cuts?
And then it ends up hurting the people who, again, are on those that down ballot. House members running for re-election, and that's something Jim Clyburn, whose endorsement we're waiting to hear, mentioned as well.
Really fascinating insights. Jamal Simmons, Molly Hooper, so great to have you. Thank you both very much. Really, really great. All right, Rena, you heard it here. Lots to chew over, and certainly lots of questions for those candidates in tonight's debate. The question will be, of course, who will they go after? Will it be Michael Bloomberg for those NDAs and some of the comments that he made and the stop and frisk policy in New York? Or will all these candidates pivot to Senator Bernie Sanders, who is, as you know, the front runner, and go after him for not just these comments that he's made, but for some of the points that you heard here from Jamal and Molly?
A lot to watch, Vlad. Thank you very much.